Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughn Manor, where it's Wednesday, which means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue, on his channel, will talk about that same comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, we're going back to the Hyborian Age with Robert E. Howard's Conan and King Conan, or as the comic is called in this omnibus, Conan the King. But the original comic was called King Conan and was later changed to Conan the King. But let's face it, King Conan's a much better name. So, once upon a time, Marvel Comics had a great comic book called Conan the Barbarian, and then they made another great comic book called Savage Sword of Conan, both based on Robert E. Howard's great hero, Conan. And Roy Thomas wrote those comics, and they were very, very successful. There was Conan the Barbarian was the color comic book, Savage Sword of Conan was the black and white magazine that had comics in black and white that were a little more mature, which, meant more people got killed and the women wore less. But they were both great. And so Roy Thomas tucked Stan Lee into doing another one. And they came out with King Conan in 1980. And let me find the cover for that original issue. That was this one right here, King Conan, and there's the splash page, which is amazing. And so King Conan, the adventures of Conan when he was a king. So those of us who read Conan, the original Conan from Robert E. Howard, we know that Conan the Barbarian eventually becomes king of Aquilonia, Conan the King. And so this series of comics from Marvel told the story of Conan when he was already a king. Now, Marvel Comics had already adapted a lot of the original stories of Robert E. Howard, those original King Conan stories. So you had already seen Conan as a king in the comic books. Savage Sword of Conan, there were some in there, and in Conan the Barbarian and the annuals, they had some King Conan stuff. So we had seen it already. But this was a whole magazine, a comic book, that was devoted to Conan's time as a king. And it was quarterly, so it was larger than a normal comic book. Had more pages, but came out less often, this quarterly comic book. And it was really cool because just like the main Conan comics, we had Roy Thomas and John Buscema. John Buscema, the ultimate comic book Conan artist in my mind. And you can see just from this opening issue, we have Conan's backstory there. And there is Conan as a king, and that is Khan, his son. Also named Conan, but for short they just called him Khan. Now, yeah, and it's cool. John Buscema just does a great job with this comic. It has just some phenomenal art. And it's really good. Through most of this is really, really good. I had actually not read all of these when I was a kid. I read a lot of those earlier issues, but the later issues I didn't pick those all up. Eventually, Roy Thomas left the book and was replaced by Doug Moench, who's really good, who's a really good comic book writer. I don't feel like he really had the same feel for the character of Conan that Roy Thomas had. Roy Thomas just knew this character. And then later on, I'm forgetting who took over later on. Let me just flip to the back and see, because Doug Mensch didn't stay on there forever either. See, now I'm not going to be able to find a title page with the writer because I'm looking for it. That's the way it works. Here we go. Here we go. This is Alan Zelenitz was the scripter, and Mark Silvestri was the penciler. And that's actually a really cool cover. And these later issues, you know, they're not bad. I don't think they're as good as the earlier ones. And there's one thing I have to say about the King Conan comic book itself, is that reading it, it feels more distant from the source material than Conan the Barbarian or Savage Sword of Conan, by and large. It just has a feel that's just a little different. And I suspect that might be in part because these stories in here are not based on Robert E. Howard stories, but they are based on Conan as a king as written by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter expanded on the Conan mythos. I've talked quite a bit about this in my Robert E. Howard show videos. And so I won't go over the same ground again, but it was L. Sprague de Camp, for example, who came up with Khan and the world, basically, of King Conan after the stories that Robert E. Howard told about King Conan. That is a world that is more L. Sprague de Camp's and Lynn Carter's world than it is Robert E. Howard's. And even though Roy Thomas has an excellent grasp of the character of Conan, there is that distance there, and that only seems a bit wider later on in this series as Doug Mensch takes over and as John Buscema leaves the book. It never becomes bad. It's all of this stuff is good. There's a lot of great stuff in this King Conan omnibus, or Conan the King omnibus. And I do highly recommend it, even though I don't like it quite as much as some of the earlier Conan the Barbarian stories. There's still a lot of great stuff in here, and it's a lot of fun, and I do highly recommend it. And unfortunately, since Marvel lost the license to Conan, Marvel will not be printing a second volume of Conan the King. However, their new home, and I'm forgetting the company that is taking over for Conan, the company that has the rights to Conan now, they're going to be printing some new comics. And I hear they're going to be continuing with the omnibus line. So the omnibus line of Conan will continue, just not published by Marvel. And so I don't know about the quality or the format or any of that. Who knows what it'll be like. Hopefully it'll be great. But this one omnibus Marvel was able to put out, and it is excellent. And certainly if you've picked up the other Conan stuff, you're going to want to read this stuff. This is a great little chapter of Conan, even if I don't like it quite as much as the other Marvel Conan comic books. However, after Marvel had lost the license to Conan the first time, another company, Dynamite, gained the license for a few years. And they came up with their own King Conan stories. And those can be found in what I believe is the greatest comic book representation of Conan as a king that has ever existed, and that would be this. This is Dark Horse's The Colossal King Conan. And this is indeed colossal. If you hold this up, next to Marvel's omnibus, you can see Marvel's omnibus is just like a little child's omnibus next to the colossal King Conan. This is just a wee little book next to the mighty colossal King Conan that Dark Horse put out. This is amazing. This gigantic book. This has stories by Timothy Truman and artwork by Tomas Giorello, who is probably my second or third favorite Conan artist, depending on how I'm feeling. But he's an amazing artist, and he's perfect for Conan. He knows this character, and this set of stories that you could find in this has adaptions of original Robert E. Howard material. It has the Scarlet Citadels in here, the Phoenix on the Sword, and most importantly, the Hour of the Dragon is in here, as well as other stories. There's Thoth Amon there. It's just awesome. And you look at that brooding Conan there. This is Conan. This is Conan done right. And it's just an amazing, amazing book, and it's gigantic. And one thing I like about this is that there's a framing sequence where Conan, as an old king, is telling the stories of his time as a younger king. And they really get him right as an old king. There's older Conan there, all scarred and gray-bearded. He just looks really cool. He looks like Conan as a king, in my opinion. I think this gets him right. And yeah, this is amazing. So this volume, which is impossible to find now, probably, unfortunately. I'm hoping that these stories, many of which were never reprinted by Marvel, Marvel did come up with a King Conan epic collection, which I foolishly left in the other room, which was really cool. But it didn't reprint all of the stories in this volume, which is unfortunate, because this is, I mean, I could just go on and on about the artwork and the stories, but this is just such an amazing version of King Conan. It's just great stuff. I mean, every page I turn to is amazing. So while this was good, and it has some of my Conan favorites, it has John Buscema, who is my favorite Conan artist of all time, doing a lot of the work in here, though not all of it. You have Roy Thomas, who's a fantastic writer. The colossal King Conan, it's just epic and amazing. And, you know, if anything could make a Marvel omnibus look wee and small, it's this big guy. And so I'm hoping that the new company will decide, you know what? Maybe we'll go big and reprint some of this stuff, so some of you will be able to check it out, because it's magnificent. It's King Conan. And that's all I have to say about King Conan. Check out Steve Donoghue talk about all this stuff later. And I will catch you next time.